The emperor is wearing no clothes. Now, in Hans Christian Andersen's story about an emperor who allowed himself to be deceived that he was in invisible clothes and walks out naked and all proud of himself, and everybody also, oh, it's beautiful, until a child says, the emperor is wearing no clothes. That's what I do. My name is Mark Henkel. I am the National Polygamy Advocate for the National Polygamy Rights Movement for Consenting Adults. And I've been in numerous major national media because I laid down the arguments that began the Christian polygamy movement that persuades evangelical Christians that the Bible never created the one man, one woman doctrine or prohibited polygamy. I will be showing you some of those arguments here tonight. Now, whether you're a Christian or whether you're not a Christian, these are the tools that you can use to persuade others or to persuade Christians that you know. So, as I refer to various verses, these will be the tools and arguments that do persuade evangelical Christians. And you can use these tools as well. To do that, we will be discussing, first, the grace law hypocrisy, polygamists in the Bible, the meaning of adultery in one flesh, as well as the prohibitions of leaders that were listed in the Bible. To start, we'll deal with the grace law hypocrisy. The Bible, for those who may need a simpler understanding of it, is separated in two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament was pretty much the Old Covenant with God and His people, and that is the legalism and the law and all the different things that we had to do. Whereas we come to the New Covenant as Christians, and that is saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. So no longer under the legalism, so it's instead of being under the law, being under grace. That's the primary basis that Christians operate in believing the Bible. Now, some may take the legalism of the law and go into the New Testament and continue to be legalists, but ultimately it is a flow of going from being under legalism to being under the law of love. And that's the difference of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we look to the law to find out what was sin. And we see that under the law, under the Old Testament, that polygamy was never banned. And not only so, it was regulated. You see, for example, in Exodus 21:10, it actually says, if you take another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. That's right there in the law under the legalism. That's a regulation of polygamy. In Deuteronomy 21:15, it starts with, if a man have two wives, and goes on to regulate dealing with the children. So clearly we see under the time of under the law that polygamy was not only not disallowed, but it was actually regulated. And so to suggest to go into the New Testament, which is no longer under the legalism of the law, it therefore seeks to make the marriage doctrine more legalistic in the time of grace than it ever was under the time of being under the law. A clear hypocrisy, the grace law hypocrisy. And that's what helps us understand that truly the Bible and Christianity never had the Bible to create the invented doctrine of one man, one woman. The emperor is wearing no clothes. There were numerous polygamists in the Bible. Numerous. Moses himself, who wrote the Adam and Eve story, who wrote the one flesh verse of Genesis 2:24, who wrote thou shalt not commit adultery of Exodus 20 verse 14, the seventh commandment, and wrote the polygamy regulating verses. Moses himself had 2 wives. Abraham had 3 wives. The 12 tribes of Israel were born of Israel's 4 wives. David had numerous wives. He had 8 known named wives. In fact, when David was being reproved for taking another man's wife, God sent a prophet to him, according to 2 Samuel 12:8, and get this, this is what God said in 2 Samuel 12:8 to David. I gave you all your wives. And if you had wanted more, I'd have given you more. That's in 2 Samuel 12:8. It's right there. God himself taking responsibility for giving David his wives. Jesus Christ described himself in Matthew 25 in a parable, describing himself as a polygamous bridegroom coming to marry 5 virgins. And God himself through the prophet Jeremiah chapter 3 and the prophet Ezekiel chapter 23 also describes himself in polygamous terms. Clearly the Bible never created the anti-polygamy doctrine. The emperor is wearing no clothes. This now brings us to the adultery and one flesh. Adultery is not given to us in English. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It was written to us in Hebrew. And the Hebrew word for adultery in the 7th commandment is na'af. And the word na'af means woman who breaks wedlock. Now, without getting into the inegalitarianism that some of us may have about this, we're looking at it purely from an intellectual standpoint. This is what the word means. The word means woman who breaks wedlock. So, if a man marries a woman who is not married to another man, and marries another woman who's not married to another man, no woman has broken her wedlock. Therefore, no adultery has occurred. That's how a man in the Bible could marry more than one woman. It was not adultery. Even Moses himself, who wrote, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," had two wives. And he's also the one who wrote Genesis 2:24, that the two shall be one flesh. And that doesn't mean you can't be more than one flesh with one than another, because Moses was. As it says in Genesis 2:24, that a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. But clearly that doesn't mean he can only be to one, because as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that as a man who's married can be one flesh with what's called a harlot, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he also can remain married to himself, to his wife. It does not mean he is suddenly no longer one flesh to his own wife. And also in the plural, it's one aspect of wives to a husband is one flesh, the same as believers of one spirit to Christ. And when Jesus requoted that in Matthew 19, he said, merely was answering a question about divorce, where the Pharisees had asked him, is it okay to divorce for every reason? And he said no. But that doesn't make it an answer that suddenly becomes anti-polygamy. That becomes a thing that's anti-divorce, merely quoting Genesis 2:24 from the polygamist Moses, who originally wrote the one flesh verse. So what we've seen is that truly the understanding of adultery and the one flesh passage clearly do not support the one man, one woman, or anti-polygamy viewpoint. It's not in the Bible. The emperor is wearing no clothes. And that brings us now to the leadership. In Deuteronomy 17, it says that a king shall not multiply wives unto himself, nor horses. Now that doesn't create an exclusion of only one. That just says shall not multiply, shall not hoard. Because if he can't multiply have more than one wife, then that means he can't have more than one wife, more than one horse. That doesn't make sense. And not only that, it just simply was that it's not an exclusion to only one. That also then we see that was only to kings and not to everybody. And then also you see in the New Testament where it refers to the husband of one wife. The 3 verses only, which is in 1 Timothy 3:2, 3:12, and Titus 1:6. And those are only instructions for bishops, elders, and deacons shall be the husband of one wife. It doesn't say it for everybody else. It says only for bishops, elders, and deacons. And not only so, again, go back using Strong's Gospel Concordance of the Bible, go back to the Greek word, and the Greek word for one and one wife is mia. And the word mia translates to first. As in, on the first day of the week, when the women found the open tomb after the resurrection. The first day of the week. The word mia translates to first, that he should be the husband of first wife. Suddenly we realize this is not a limitation of one wife, this is a limitation against divorce, as we saw Jesus was doing earlier. So clearly that the husband must be the husband of his first wife. And clearly this helps us understand this never created a prohibition for polygamy. It only created a restriction, if anything, for bishops, elders, and deacons. And so again we see the emperor is wearing no clothes. Through this we've seen the arguments. We have seen that the grace law hypocrisy. We have seen polygamists in the Bible. We have seen the real understanding of adultery and one flesh. And we have seen that limitations only on kings, bishops, elders, and deacons. Clearly, the Bible never created the invented one man, one woman doctrine. And that is what I have done, and what has catapulted me to the national stage and all the major media interviews and so forth, is the bringing of these arguments to persuade Christians, my fellow Christians, that the Bible never created the one man, one woman doctrine. The emperor is wearing no clothes.